Right, in this tutorial what we're going to do is I'm going to give you an example of texture scale and texture tiling. Basically I'm just going to give a quick demonstration with regards to how texture size dictates the scale of the scene. So I'm just going to basically create a quick plane in the viewport and drop in again, trusty teapot, and just turn up a couple of iterations on this. Now when you're actually texturing up your scene, you really need to use textures that actually tell the end user or end viewer exactly how big the actual object is. Now there's two things which can basically portray this. One is texture size, another one is lighting. When we were talking about the decay of the light, the actual how far the actual light attenuates or decays dictates exactly how big the scene is. Say for example, if you've got a street light in, you basically want a fall off or decay that's relevant to the actual size. Same principle with the texture scale. For example, if we basically pull up the standard max library and apply a simple brick texture to it, let my computer catch up. There we go. And then just simply apply that to the plane. Now that obviously tells us straight away exactly how big this teapot is in relation to the brickwork. So this teapot in essence is quite big, basically, judging by how big a standard brick actually is. Obviously if we take the actual size down or increase the actual size of the plane, so for example if we had the plane that was actually really large, then we're using exactly the same texture to tile it, the actual teapot, even though the actual scale of the thing hasn't actually changed at all, it now, when we actually come to render the thing, looks like it's really small. So what does this tell us? What we basically need to do is, when we're actually using stock textures, like for example this standard brick texture, what we need to do is we need to be able to tile it if we need to cover a large area to keep the actual same visual representation of scale. So therefore what we need to do is, with this particular plane, if you want to keep the same size as we had before, which was but yeah, let's say let's put it about 200 by 200. What we can do is, if we increase it to say 800 by 800, what we need to do is to remap it to say that the texture scale was or is back to what its original size. So we can obviously specify the actual dimensions of that, so we can put it back to 200 by 200, obviously not changing the actual dimensions of the image itself, but we're actually tiling the image using a UVW map to specify the actual dimensions, and thus keeping the actual scene, keeping the texture the same scale. This is handy by using UVW mapping here, basically because we can actually drop back down to the plane, and we can actually increase and decrease the length as necessary with a primitive object. Obviously if it's hand modeled, we can't really do this unless we actually scale. If we have, like for example, an edit mesh underneath, and just show end results here, we can basically just turn that off, scale this up and down accordingly. If you notice there's a bit of a ripple here, that's not actually in the final render. That won't be in the final render, basically because I'm using software viewport display tools, not OpenGL or Direct 3D, so the recording software can actually record it correctly. So if we don't have a tiling texture, this one is, although we have what's called macro repeats in here. For example, this block here, we can actually see how this texture is actually repeating. So we can't actually really get away with this a great deal apart, maybe a couple of times tiling, but apart from that, we don't really want to use a texture like this to populate a large area, say for example in front of a house or something, basically because we'll be able to see the repeats. So the best way to get around this is to would be to snapshot this particular area and then take it into Photoshop, and then we can actually we could even simply render this entire thing out and then literally paint out the odd macro repeat and then remap it directly on using another UVW map with the resulting texture which is cleaned up. Another way to get around the texture tiling problem, to basically retile it so it's to the same size. If you notice that we've basically done like a factor of 2, factor of 3 tile on here, we can literally go into our UVW map, into our bitmap map, and we can increase the tiling rate in here once it catches up again. There we go. So again, same principle as before, we've basically got this texture which is given some repeats. Now when we're having things like, for example, let me just pull up an additional one. Grass is a prime example of this. Actually no, we'll bring up the one of the dirt ones because that's more commonly used, and we'll assign that to the plane. So again, same principle as before. If we set the dimensions down, again same principle, we'll basically notice we've got some tiling issues here. Now this particular map itself is actually tileable, but what if we need to apply, actually it's partially tileable, we can see some edges here. So what we can do actually is we can basically clean this up and we can go into Photoshop and remove these harsh edges. So if we take this particular image, I'm just going to do a quick shortcut here. So we basically go to this grey dirt map. If we go into, it's going to be in ground, and here we go. I can literally right click on it, edit in Photoshop, which will take me into Photoshop momentarily. Still got the bedroom image up, so I'm just going to close that. Okay, so this is the actual size of our image itself. Now what we'd need to do is obviously paint out any problem areas, so I'm basically using a pen tablet here. So to do that, what I'm going to do, so I don't amend the original, I'm going to duplicate the layer, and then using the offset feature, I'm going to scoot this across so we can see, if I just put that back to 0, we can see where our overlap is. So we can see that the overlap is roughly around about this region here. So all we really need to do then is pull that across to the center. Okay. We can then grab either, if you're in Photoshop CS, you've got the healing brush tool, which is this guy here. If not, you can basically just use this clone or rubber stamp tool, which is simply a similar case. You can literally just increase the brush size, hold down Alt to point sample an area, and then paint in where the seam is to literally paint the seam out. I'm just doing it basically and rudimentarily at the moment, but you obviously spend a bit of time and you can literally paint the seam out really easily. But with the rubber stamp tool, sorry, with the healing brush tool, what this basically does is it goes through and not only clones like the stamp tool, like the clone tool, sorry, but it also blends together. So if I literally just go down like this, it will then calculate and blend the bits together. So I can then merge each side with the next. Okay, same principle as doing it horizontally. We now need to go through and do it vertically as well. Okay, so same principle as before. Need to go to the offset. I'm going to put this back to normal, so that's going to be a negative now, 4 and 5, and this one I'm going to offset it by, let's just put that back to 0, see exactly where the seam was. So the seam itself is around about this region here. So we can go through and take areas again and paint those out, extend it down, so we can quite easily bring this down and get rid of any duplicate areas. Obviously not go right to the edges, basically, because that's our seam that we've just painted out. If we go right to the edges, then we're going to have another problem. We're going to have another seam to paint out that we have originally painted out. So actually, let's just go right to the edge. I'm going to go right to the edge here, and then I'll offset again and paint out. So let's offset that again, and let's just see if there are any problems that we need to get rid of. So maybe a bit here that can go. I'm going to get rid of some of this as well. I'm going to get rid of some of that stuff. So I'm literally just scribbling over it, and the healing brush is just cleaning it all up. Now, there's some dark areas here that I need to get rid of, basically because when it's retiled, it's going to create a few macro repeats. Same with any like harsh white areas like this guy around this region here. So I'm literally holding down Alt, selecting, and then painting out. Okay, so I'm going to offset that back as well. And then I'm going to offset that to the side just to make sure any areas that I have overlapped have been painted out. So anything down here can basically go. So I've got repeat here and here, so that one of those guys can go. Yeah, this guy here as well. So that's basically our now tiled texture. So that entire thing can now be saved. So I'm just going to call that, I'm just going to drop that back in your video tutorials folder. So I'm going to call that grey dirt tiled amended. Now this particular texture side, I've actually saved it as a JPEG. I shouldn't save it as a JPEG, I should save it as a bitmap. Let me just put that back in. Tiled amended. Ooh. Save it as a bitmap. And the reason I'm saving it as a bitmap and not a JPEG is because we may get some compression artifacts. Now, even though the file size, it will take less, if you had like a really large texture size, even though it will take less time for Max to load in, you really want to use bitmap maps and targets and TIFFs and any other uncompressed format as much as possible. Reason being is because Max actually uses more memory to decompress the image to display it when it actually loads it in. So for example, if you've got like a 3000 or 10,000 even pixel wide image, it may take less time to load in, but it will actually use a larger memory footprint. So therefore, you've got a larger chance of the system crashing, or sorry, Mac's crashing out because it runs out of memory, than you would actually having a larger file-sized image that's uncompressed, like for example a bitmap or a Targa. Okay, so I'm going to go back into Max now, and I'm going to go to the folder where we've been saving all the tutorial stuff. I'm just going to ditch that JPEG. Oh, sugar. Wrong one. Let's just delete that. And I'm going to delete that as well. Grab the bitmap. And then as we render, we've got a nicer tile. We've got a few repeats. If you notice, there's one here, and so on. With those we can actually paint out. We can basically go back into Photoshop, and if we locate it, I believe it's this guy up here as well. So if I offset that guy, it's this chap here, I can go through and I can paint him out. Same deal with this, and then resave. And Max will automatically load it back in. I can re-render. So that's pretty much cleaned up majority of that. So we've still got one or two little issues around here because we've tiled it a fair few times. To get around that, what we can do is we can actually mix two versions of the same material or the same map together. To do that, what we can use is a mix map. So if you keep the old map as a submap, okay, we'll drop in, actually how have we got this done? We were using a texture map size, aren't we? Actually using a map size for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ditch that. I'm going to amend the tiling on this one to 3x3. Actually, let's do it to 4x4. So if we render that, yeah, we've got pretty much what we had to start with. That's good. So we've got a 4x4 tile here, and I'm going to copy this particular map into the next slot. So this particular one, I'm going to do it for a tile of 2x2. Now the reason I'm doing that is if we just look at our, if I turn off show and result, that is basically because our mix amount is set to 0, so it's using this entire slot here. So we can see all these repeats and everything. Now if I increase this to say 50%, oh, gone too far. We've got a blend between the two. Now the problem is with that is that it looks pretty crap because we're blending two together. We've also got this kind of large seam down the middle, so what I think I'll do is I'll actually change this to a tile of 3x3, so we do get a larger offset, so we don't get as much of this line down there. Okay, so if we render this, we'll see a problem straight away, and that is that the texture has gone kind of blurry because it's actually blending the two together just using a crossfade effect. It's just like 50% on that, 50% on that. It's not really, you know, generating a really nice result. So what we can do is we can use an additional map in here to actually control this mixing value instead. So to do that, what I'm going to use is something like a, just like a noise map. And I'll set it to explicit map so we can actually see exactly what we're going to get. So because I've set it to explicit map, we obviously need to dial the size down now. So I'm going to take that all the way down to about 5. Let's do it pretty low actually. So let's do it 0.05. So it kind of breaks it up. And then to actually get some, so it doesn't look as blurry when it mixes it together, I'm actually going to take that size up, I think 0.1, and then I'm going to take this high threshold down, which is the white, so make it stronger, and the low, bring that up. So this is like going to be more intense areas of one color slot in comparison with the other one. So in essence, we're basically going from that to that. So we've got some nice, more defined areas. I think just to top it off, what we'll do is we'll use a fractal noise, which will break it up even more, make it look a bit more natural. So when we render it out, we've got a nicer distribution. We've got a bit of a line down here still, which we can basically offset out the way if we just take one and just scoot that across just to get it out of the road, and that'll break it up a lot nicer. So we've got a nice large texture now that we can't really see any seams in, that we can populate a large area and we're not going to see any macro repeats, and we're using just one main texture for it, just by using a mix map, a procedural map to blend the two together, and a slight amount of offset and different types of tiling. Now obviously this type of solution doesn't work with things like wood. It won't work with effects like brickwork or anything like that. It will mainly only work for like concrete effects, ground, dirt, that kind of thing. Anything that's kind of relatively random to start with. Grass is also a prime example. Additionally to this, what we can also do is we can obviously mix different types of material together. Like for example, I'm just going to drop this in the bump map for starters. Let me just do that, and that's going to be the final result, because we were using the original texture in the bump map to start with. So what we can do is we can obviously mix different textures together, again using the mix map. Same principle as before. We're going to mix this entire mix map here with another material or another texture, say a grass. So we've got like little splodges of dirt within a larger area of grass, or vice versa, using either a procedural material or a painted texture. So to do that, all we need to do is just go to click on the mix. We can add another mix map and then keep the old one as a sub map, so therefore it's dropping that. So the top level here, if we look at our material tree, we've got if you ignore the bump for the time being, we've got this mix map which we've just dropped in, and that's dropped in the original one that we've created into one of its slots. So that's that guy there. So if I just name that, let's just call that dirt mix. And then what we want to do is we can just drop in, for the time being, let's just drop in again, standard map, sorry. And we'll use let's use one of the standard grass ones. Yeah, you'll do. And we can use this obviously we can obviously mix this using a noise, or I think what we'll do this time is we'll use a smoke to mix the two together. Now if I render that out, we're going to have some small little patches, but it's not going to look that defined, so it's not going to look that good. So I'm going to change this to explicit map, drop the size down again. The reason I'm using explicit map is so that whatever I see in here, I know that is exactly the same thing that is going to be mapped onto this. If I'm using object XYZ, then whatever I see in here may not be a representation of what I'm actually going to get, at the end of the day. It also might mean that you might want to map this cylindrically or any other particular way that you want. So I'm going to drop this down again to 0.1, maybe a bit too much, that'll do. Render that out. So I've got some larger areas, but they're still quite blurry around the edges. So I'm going to tweak the exponent so that we get a more uniform and defined area. So we can actually see in the viewport here what we're roughly going to get. And then if I need to increase the amount of iterations, I can, and strengthen that up. So again, we're mixing the dirt mix with a grass material, a grass map, using a procedural map. Now, again, same problem as before. If I center the teapot and then just render that guy out, you'll see the same problem that we've had before, that even though we've kind of fixed this dirt, we've now got a large version of the grass which is stretched over this entire plane. So what we need to do is obviously take this ground, this grass, and tile it if necessary. Let's just bring it into Photoshop. We'll have a look to see if there are any tiling issues with it. So it's grass 2. Let's edit that with Photoshop, and then we'll try offsetting just to see whether or not we do have any issues with it. So let's offset that, and by the looks of things we don't seem to have many issues. What we do have is obviously this light area here where obviously the artist has obviously tiled the image. So I think what we might want to do is paint this out if we can. So let's quickly just, again, same principle as before, go through and paint out any of these problem areas that are going to cause any macro repeats. So we had a few there, which is like a repeat of that down there. So anything like that needs to basically go pretty much straight away, otherwise it's going to be very, very apparent when we actually come to dropping in our tile. So I'm just going to bring that back and then get rid of any of these issues. Okay, I think that this should roughly about do it. It's just, again, random texture. We can literally just scribble over it just to get rid of some of the tiling issues. So that's quite even now. Maybe a bit at the top. I think I'll just offset that as well, just to make sure. So we've got a bit of a line here as well, so I'm just going to scoot over there, get rid of that guy as well. Maybe a bit of the line down there, a bit across there as well. So that kind of breaks it all up. So that can then be saved. So let's call that grass tiled amended. Don't need to save that, don't need to save that. Back into Max, and what we'll then do is load back in this new texture, and we can then, same principle as before, we can tile it a few times. So let's do this one with the same principle as we did with the last one. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to copy this map, I'm going to rename it, let's call it grass mix, and we can simply replace the textures as we did before. So we don't need to set any of this tiling and offsetting, basically, because we've already got it kind of set. Okay. So now what we should have is a nice even texture that's at the right size. maybe this smoke needs to be a bit more defined. So to do that, I'm going to set this smoke to a sub map, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp off. So I'm going to intensify the light and dark areas. So the light area is obviously one map, the dark area is another one. So it is going to give it a lot more definition. So let's have a look at the result of that. So we see some patches of green. I think, to be honest, what we need to do is invert that. And that's our end result. So finally, drop that into the bump map. I think maybe increase that to about 60, and then we'll render that out again. So that's basically our finished mixed material. So we've got some nice patches of green with some texture here as well. Now, one thing that is remaining is the final mapping problem. Now, what problem that is that the actual texture itself is, if we just view image, the texture itself isn't square. Now, when you're designing textures, it's always best to do them as a square texture, say a 512 by 512, 256 by 256, 1024 by 1024, and so on. Basically a power of 2 map, exactly the same kind of principle as the light shadow maps. So it uses less memory overhead and only the amount of memory that you actually need for that particular material. So what is basically best for this, because we've actually got a map here which is now obviously squished horizontally, because we're actually this actually fills the texture obviously fills the entire map. What we basically need to do is we need to put it back to the same kind of proportions. So if hopefully, if memory serves, this particular map should be roughly the same size in proportion as the grass one, which it is. Thankfully, we can now put it back to its right proportions by adding a UVW map. So that's set to planar, and then what we can use is use the bitmap fit button, specify the map that we want to amend its dimensions to, and that scales out or resizes the length and width parameters in the UVW mapping modifier so that the resulting texture is the correct proportions and isn't squished. That's the end of that particular tutorial. So just to cover the basic principles of it, we can use different types of maps, and we can even use this type of principle mix with materials as opposed to maps. So we can have different types of materials, like one shiny, one matte, using a different map to mix the two together based on luminance, i.e. black and white, which we'll cover next.